December 26th, I had just settled down to enjoy my morning coffee and an extreme Sudoku puzzle when my phone suddenly started ringing. I usually enjoy doing puzzles to warm up my brain before work, even on my days off. You see, I'm part of a group that handles suspicious computer code. Our job is to figure out its purpose, origin, and how to counteract it. I find this kind of work suits me well. I'm a bit of a nerd and I love solving puzzles. The fact that I get paid to do it is just an added bonus. Anyway, when I saw that my boss was calling, I groaned. The last thing I wanted was a call from the office during Christmas break, but when your boss calls, you have to answer. He was all business, no time for pleasantries or holiday wishes. He simply said, "I need you at the office right away." "Thomas, seriously," I whined. "It's the day after Christmas." "This is a matter of utmost importance for national security, Thomas. You need to get there as soon as possible." I let out a frustrated sigh and quickly wrote a note for Ginny, just in case she came home and found the house empty. She had gone to support a friend who was going through a tough time. It was a lot to ask of her during the holidays, but Ginny was always there for her friends. It was one of the reasons I loved her so much. After leaving the note and putting on my coat, I hopped into my car and made my way towards the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. I couldn't help but wonder what could be so urgent at this time of year. But when your boss mentions national security, you don't question it. Besides, we work for the NSA, the National Security Agency, so dealing with important security issues is our bread and butter. As I drove towards Fort Meade, the NSA headquarters, I couldn't help but wonder if this emergency had something to do with the recent project I had been working on. A few weeks ago, my boss had handed me a challenge, a complex line of code that seemed to have no purpose. It appeared to be a worm, a type of virus that infects computers and causes unwanted actions. However, we couldn't figure out what it would do if it ever found its target. I loved puzzles like this one. I thrived on the challenge of outsmarting hackers who thought they were one step ahead. Although this code had stumped us so far, I had a feeling we were close to cracking it. After going through security, I was instructed to go straight to my boss's office. This was unusual for me, as I rarely had direct contact with him. When I entered the office, I found him deep in conversation with his director. I knew something was up. Ben, my manager, seemed uneasy. He stumbled on his words for a moment before looking at his director and then back at me. "Thomas, there's no easy way to say this, so I'll just be direct. Your wife is having an affair." I was completely taken aback. I had no idea why he had called me in, and this revelation felt like a punch to the gut. "No," I exclaimed, jumping to my feet. "That's impossible. How could you say such a horrible thing?" My sudden reaction startled Ben, but he realized I wasn't going to attack him. He settled back in his chair and exchanged a worried glance with his director. The director stood up and began pacing behind Ben. "Thomas, I know this is a shock, but it happens more often than you think. You have to face it head on." "No, I don't," I said angrily. "Because it's not true. You're wrong. You must have made a mistake." They exchanged another look before the director shrugged his shoulders. "We didn't want to delve into the explicit details, but it seems there's no other way to convince you," he motioned to Ben, who proceeded to play a recorded file on his computer. The director continued, "This call was recorded on Christmas Eve, but we didn't get a chance to analyze it until this morning. Once we heard it, Ben called you," and he nodded towards Ben, who had the file ready to play. Then he looked at me again. "You should sit down for this." Ben clicked a button and Ginny's voice filled the room. The sound quality wasn't great due to the cell phone recording, but I could still recognize her voice. "I hate that we can't be together these next 2 days," she said, with an intensity I hadn't heard in a while. "What's the matter, baby? Wasn't our last encounter satisfying enough?" a male voice asked. "No, never," Ginny replied passionately. "Being intimate with you only makes me crave more. You're like a drug to me." I felt a wave of sickness wash over me. Ben looked at me with concern and offered to end the recording, but I shook my head. I needed to hear it. The man's laugh on the recording infuriated me. "When do you think we can see each other again?" he asked. "Well, Christmas Day is definitely out," Ginny responded. "But I'll find a way to leave the house the next day. I'll tell Thomas that my friend is feeling down and needs some support. He always falls for that." I ground my teeth upon hearing that revelation. "What would you want me to do to you if we were together right now?" the man's voice asked teasingly. Ginny's voice grew husky. "If you were here, I'd want you to touch my body. I'd want you to caress it and hug me until I am going crazy. And then, oh baby, I'd want you to explore further with your gentle touch and make me feel as aroused as my sensitive areas. And when I can't resist anymore, I'd want you to make love to me slowly and passionately. I'd be trying to move and show you how much I want it, but you would hold me back and tease me until I'm just about to lose control." There was a shiver in her voice. "Oh baby, just thinking about it is making me shiver. Stop it," I yelled, startling Ben. Hearing her talk like that to another man was beyond what I could handle. My beloved Ginny, the woman I cherished, had betrayed me. Without that recording, I would never have believed it. And now having to listen to it in front of my boss and his director made it all the more humiliating. I closed my eyes, wishing I could hide under a desk. Ben looked at me with concern. "Are you okay, Thomas? Can I do anything for you?" "No," I replied quietly, shaking my head as I tried to process what I had just heard. "Just give me a minute, I'll be fine then." Anger surged within me as a thought crossed my mind. "Hold on a minute. Why were you tapping into my wife's phone calls? You had no right to invade her privacy." The director stepped forward, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "It's not that simple, Thomas," I interrupted him. "It is that simple. You were spying on my wife. She's a private citizen, and she doesn't even work for the government. You had no right to do that." "Thomas, we weren't specifically targeting Ginny. Our computer detected the voice pattern of her partner, which prompted us to listen to the conversation." I looked at him, feeling confused. The director ran a hand through his graying hair. "Thomas, this is not easy to hear, but your wife's lover is on our terrorist watch list. We suspect he's an agent of Al-Qaeda or ISIS these days. It's hard to distinguish between them." I thought I had already experienced the worst shock of my life. Little did I know that there was more. "Ginny might be unfaithful, but she's not a terrorist," I gasped. "She would never involve herself with those people." When the news about the recent terror attack broke, she was outraged. We had numerous conversations about it. Take a deep breath, Thomas. Nobody believes Ginny is directly connected to any terrorist organization. We believe this man targeted her initially. I felt a slight relief. It wasn't Ginny's fault some Middle Eastern James Bond had set out to seduce her, but I couldn't escape the fact that she had given in to him. Why was she seeing this guy? Why was she flirting with someone other than me? Our marriage had been strong, so when did she stop loving me? But I set those questions aside to try to comprehend the other shocking information I had just received. I don't understand, why would a terrorist group target Ginny? It makes no sense. Ben put a hand on my shoulder. Think about it, Thomas. They don't care about Ginny, they want to use her to get closer to you. Why would anyone want to get close to me, I asked. We can't be sure, but we think they want to use Ginny to get to you, and to use you to gain information about the NSA. It's the only thing that makes sense. I slumped in my chair and looked around the office, hoping to find some sort of explanation for this madness. My eyes landed on a Christmas wreath hanging from Ben's window, and it seemed out of place. Christmas was a thing of the past now, in more ways than one. I doubted I would ever experience peace on earth, goodwill to men again. Ben's director leaned over the desk and placed his hands on it, peering at me intently. Thomas, I have an important question for you. I stared at him, confused. Thomas, can you pretend like none of this happened when you see Ginny tonight? Can you act like you don't know anything about what we've learned? I looked at him as if he had lost his mind. No way, I said firmly. He glanced at Ben, then back at me. That's what I thought, he said. I wouldn't be able to do it either if I were in your shoes. So here's the plan. We're going to send you out of town for a few days, keep you out of harm's way, until we have a better understanding of what's going on. What's the issue? I asked angrily. Just go pick him up and interrogate him. I'll even volunteer to help with the investigation, I added. Both of them exchanged glances. That's the problem. Thomas Amir has disappeared, and he may have left Washington. His cell phone signal is off, and he's no longer in the apartment where he was living. A thought crossed my mind, and although it felt odd after what I had just learned, I had to ask. What about Ginny? Is she in danger? I don't think so, the director reassured me. She wasn't Amir's real target, just a means to an end. But don't worry, the FBI will keep a close eye on her. I felt some relief hearing that. Ginny's actions had hurt me deeply, but I couldn't bring myself to wish harm upon her. My feelings for her ran deep, and I couldn't just turn them off so suddenly. I looked at the two men. So what do I do now? You need to go home and pack a bag right away. Then head to Washington National immediately. We're sending you to Oak Ridge. Your reservations have already been made, the director explained. There's a Southwest flight to Nashville at noon. We will arrange for someone to meet you at the airport and drive you to Oak Ridge. As I tried to process everything, the director added, "Don't forget to leave Ginny a note, so she won't suspect anything in case Amir contacts her again." When I arrived home to our cozy bungalow, everything seemed different. The familiar furniture and decorations that were once comforting now felt foreign. Our home used to be filled with dreams and aspirations, but now all of those seemed distant. Writing the note to Ginny was a struggle. I wanted to express everything that was in my heart, but I knew I couldn't. I remembered the information about her lover and didn't want to give away that we were aware of him. So I kept my message simple and straightforward, resisting the urge to leave my wedding ring on top of it. However, I did take off my ring and slip it into my pocket. The symbol of our bond was broken beyond repair the moment I heard that recording. During the 2-hour flight, I attempted to distract myself with a Sudoku puzzle from the in-flight magazine, but I couldn't focus. My hand instinctively reached into my pocket, touching the ring. If only it had the power to turn back time and undo all of this. But then I reminded myself that the underlying issues that pushed Ginny towards infidelity would still exist if given the opportunity. I was so messed up that I couldn't even escape into a decent fantasy. As I walked off the jet bridge at Nashville International, a large man with a bulge under his sports coat approached me. "Are you Thomas Selfridge?" he asked. I started to respond, but then I realized I didn't know who he was. "Do you have any identification?" I inquired. He sighed, pulled out his wallet, and flashed an FBI badge. I nodded and walked alongside him. "How did you know it was me?" I asked. "They told me to look for the most melancholic person on the plane," he said, without a hint of amusement. We continued walking together, and I felt even more dejected knowing that my sadness was noticeable to everyone. I didn't catch your name on your badge," I said, attempting to strike up a conversation. "Henry," he replied as we walked down the concourse. "Is Henry your first name or last?" I asked, trying to keep up. "Both," he answered, still walking. I shook my head. Between my sadness and Henry's reticence, the drive to Oak Ridge seemed like it would be a joyless experience. I had checked the Google map at the airport before leaving, so I knew that Oak Ridge was a little over 150 miles to the east on I-40. It meant we had a 2-hour drive ahead of us. As expected, Henry remained silent for most of the journey. However, when we passed the exit for Harriman, he nudged me and nodded towards the left. I looked up and did a double take. 2 gigantic smokestacks loomed above the low ridges and trees. Even with the shadows cast by the winter afternoon, the towers still caught the light. The view felt surreal, like a painting by De Chirico. "What is that?" I asked, amazed. "Kingston Steam Plant," Henry explained. "It generates 1.7 gigawatts of electricity, with most of it going to the NSA and Oak Ridge National Laboratory." We crossed a bridge, providing a full view of the structure. "How tall are those things?" I wondered. "Just over 1,000 feet," Henry replied, "taller than the Eiffel Tower." As I absorbed that information, I realized that this was the longest conversation Henry and I had exchanged throughout the entire trip. "How do you know so much about this?" I asked curiously. He glanced at me. "I grew up around here," he answered. Then he abruptly exited the interstate onto State Route 58, heading north towards Oak Ridge. Shortly after, he pulled into the parking lot of a roadside motel. "Too late to go visiting tonight," he said. "We'll stay here." I gave him a skeptical look. "Don't worry. The rooms may be small, but they're clean," he assured me. Great, I thought sarcastically. A terrible day just got a little worse. December 27th, surprisingly, the motel turned out to be more comfortable than I anticipated, and the breakfast they served the next morning was delicious. I had never tried grits before, but to my surprise, I enjoyed them. Afterwards, we got back in the car and drove to the gates of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Despite being on the approved visitors list, the security was still incredibly stringent. The NSA's operation at Oak Ridge was known as the Multi-Program Research Facility, although everyone simply referred to it as Building 5300. The team at Building 5300 focused primarily on code breaking. In today's world, that meant utilizing immense computing power to decrypt data until it surrendered its secrets. My specialty was different. I analyzed computer software of unknown origin and neutralized it. The Oak Ridge team specialized in decryption, so my interactions with them had been limited. However, as they showed me their equipment and tools, ideas began to form in my mind. In essence, Building 5300 housed what was likely the world's largest and fastest computer. Its sheer size occupied an entire warehouse and required extensive cooling to prevent overheating. And the speed. The current version of their computer operated at an exascale level, capable of performing 10 to the 18th power calculations per second. Even the strongest encryption couldn't withstand that power. What fascinated me was the possibility of using this computing power to combat viruses, worms, and Trojan horses. Each hacker had their own style and unique way of solving problems. It occurred to me that by analyzing the coding patterns, it might be possible to identify the creator of malware. It's like how a linguist can determine the origin and time of a text based on the choice of words, spellings, and phrases. The head technician exclaimed excitedly. We just need enough samples to identify patterns and tendencies. I felt a sense of accomplishment with that idea and vowed to present it to my boss as soon as I returned to Fort Meade. Businesses and governments were increasingly falling prey to cyber attacks. This could be a way to trace the source of an attack and pinpoint its origin. Just then, I heard a grunt behind me. I turned around and saw Henry looking at his watch. He had patiently followed me all day, but now he was subtly and not so subtly indicating that it was time to wrap up. I checked my phone and realized how late it had gotten. That evening, Henry drove me into the city of Oak Ridge and took me to Dean's restaurant for dinner. The place wasn't much to look at, being housed in a converted pharmacy, but the fried catfish Henry ordered tasted amazing. If everything is this good, I might become a Southerner, I joked. He didn't laugh. When I returned to my room at the motel, I turned on my cell phone and discovered a voicemail from Ginny. My abrupt business trip had caught her off guard, and she was both surprised and annoyed that I hadn't told her when I'd be back. I guess I'm making it difficult for her to plan her next rendezvous with Amir, I thought bitterly as I considered deleting her message. However, I replayed it instead, listening closely to her voice. It was strange her voice sounded the same, yet I couldn't ignore the sensual tone she had used with her lover. How could someone be simultaneously recognizable and unfamiliar? Eventually, I turned off my phone and collapsed onto the bed. As I lay there, memories of our life together flooded my mind. I remembered the time when Ginny had come home devastated because her best friend had caught her husband cheating. I told her to kick him out and find a top-notch lawyer to take everything from him, she had angrily declared. If he didn't want to stay married, he could have at least filed for divorce. There was no need to cheat, although I had agreed with Ginny's assessment. I'd been somewhat surprised at her strong reaction. But at least I was reassured about my own marriage, because it was obvious that Ginny would never betray me. What a fool you were, I cursed myself. What a hypocrite she is. December 28th, after breakfast, I was scheduled to take a tour of the Y12 complex. That, of course, is where they made the bomb, and it's in a different area of the reservation. I never realized how big the Oak Ridge Reservation is. Henry drove me through rolling hills and woodlands that were uninhabited, and suddenly we came upon an industrial complex the size of a small town. At Building 5300, I was among people from my own agency, and we could discuss work-related matters. At Y12, I was just another visitor, and it didn't take long for me to see that my guide thought I was a waste of his time. For that matter, I felt the same way. I understood that my boss wanted me out of the way, so I wouldn't give away any information to Ginny and Amir that we were onto them. But surely I could be doing something more interesting than wandering around a highly classified nuclear weapons manufacturing facility. Besides, I disliked nuclear weapons and didn't want to be any closer to them than necessary. So when it was lunchtime, I approached Henry and asked if there were any other activities we could do instead of following my bored tour guide. Henry's face actually turned into a smile. We made our excuses to my guide, and Henry led me to the car and took me to another local eatery outside the reservation. Over lunch, I asked him if there was anything else worth seeing in the area. For sure, he said. There are some beautiful landscapes about a half-hour drive from here. If you're willing to go off the main roads that sounded appealing to me at that point, almost anything would have, so I eagerly agreed. After lunch, we headed west-northwest from Oak Ridge to Frozen Head State Park. When I asked Henry about the peculiar name, he explained that it was named after the main peak, which often had snow cover during the colder months. We were already traveling on an old state highway when we turned north toward the little town of Petros, where the park entrance was located. As we entered the park, our car started to climb as the highway became a series of curves and switchbacks going up Fork Mountain. The speed limit was a mere 10 mph, and given the icy conditions and sharp turns, I thought even that was too fast. The park was mostly filled with deciduous trees, and with no leaves to obstruct the view, the scenery was breathtaking. Henry made a point of showing off each viewpoint to me, so he didn't notice the SUV that passed us and attempted to overtake us. But instead of passing us, it abruptly crashed into the side of our car. "Darn it," Henry exclaimed and swerved to the right, but the other vehicle followed and collided with us again. As our tires left the road, Henry desperately fought to regain control of the car. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might succeed. Then the world flipped upside down as our car flipped and rolled. When the view through the windshield stopped spinning, we found ourselves upside down, held in place by our seatbelts. Something caught my attention in front of us, and I struggled to comprehend the inverted sight. After a moment, I saw the SUV that had collided with us pull into a nearby Jeep trail, then reverse and turn around. "He's coming back to hurt us," I shouted. Henry continued to curse and fought to retrieve his firearm. Just as the SUV started accelerating toward us, another car swiftly passed us and headed straight for it. I instinctively closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable crash, but at the last moment, the SUV driver seemingly changed his mind and swerved away from the collision. The sudden turn caused the driver to lose control, and the SUV flipped multiple times before falling down a ravine. I couldn't see the exact outcome, but I could hear the noise as the car scraped against the rocks and crashed into the enormous trees below. The second car came to a stop near the edge of the ravine where the SUV had fallen. Then a figure sprinted towards us, and to my surprise, I realized it was a woman. She wore jeans, a leather jacket, and tall boots. Her dark hair was cut short and styled straight back. But I stopped admiring her when I noticed the menacing combat knife she held. "Now she's coming after us," I thought, resuming my struggle to free myself. The woman hurried to Henry's side of the car, knelt down, and reached through the shattered window to cut the straps of his seatbelt. As Henry maneuvered himself out through the window, she walked around to my side and prepared to free me as well. "Make sure you hold on to something," she said in a slightly accented voice, "otherwise you'll fall on your head." I grabbed onto the car seat, but I still ended up landing awkwardly when she cut through my seatbelt. She began pulling me out of the car, but suddenly jerked away as she noticed something. I looked up to see Henry disappear as he climbed down the bank where the SUV had crashed. "No, come back," the woman yelled, rushing after Henry. "Get away from there," she cried, desperately trying to get his attention. Just as she neared the ravine, I heard a strange voice shout something like "Los Angeles." Then a deafening explosion occurred, and the mysterious woman was knocked down by the blast. I managed to scramble out of the car and ran to her side. As I helped her to her feet, I asked, "What on earth was that?" She wore a stern expression. "They call it a martyr's vest. They're all wearing them now." I wasn't sure what she meant, but suddenly the memory of my companion returned. "Henry," I shouted, moving towards the ravine. But the woman reached out and grabbed my arm. "Unless you have significant combat experience, it's best not to go down there and witness that." "I'm sorry, but your friend is gone," she shook her head with frustration. "Aren't your people briefing your agents about what to expect?" I still didn't understand what she was referring to, but I obediently followed her back to her car. "What should we do about Henry?" I asked as she started the engine. "Someone needs to be informed about what happened to him." She shook her head angrily. "Right now our priority is to get away from here." "There might be another group sent after us." "Who sent them?" I inquired, securing my seatbelt. "Whichever group. For now, the distinctions don't matter. They want to harm you, and my mission is to ensure that doesn't happen." I involuntarily glanced over my shoulder, but no one seemed to be following us. When I faced forward again, I noticed a red, gooey substance that had splattered on the windshield. The woman activated the wipers and cleaned it away. That was part of Henry, I thought to myself, feeling sickened. Then I realized that Henry and the woman must have been working together. I turned to her and said, "I'm sorry about your partner." "What partner?" she asked, looking puzzled. "Henry, the man who was blown up back there." "He wasn't my partner. I'm not affiliated with the FBI." Now I was even more confused. "But if you're not FBI, then who are you with?" She glanced at me briefly before returning her gaze to the road. "I'm with Mossad," she replied softly. I gaped at her. "The Israeli intelligence agency? Why does Mossad have an interest in me?" I demanded. A determined expression formed on her face. "Currently, we're trying to protect you," she retorted as the car navigated a tight downhill turn. Feeling bewildered, I slumped back in my seat, unable to fully grasp the situation I found myself in. As I sat there trying to comprehend what was happening, I noticed that we had left the park and were now heading back towards I-40. Now that we weren't speeding through dangerous turns, I thought it might be safe to seek some answers. "All right, well, I am grateful that you saved my life back there. I don't even know your name," I muttered. She glanced at me again, a faint smile appearing on her face. "I'm Esther Freeman," she said. "Nice to meet you, Thomas Selfridge." We were now back on the interstate, driving towards Oak Ridge. I observed as she set the cruise control slightly above the speed limit. The shock of the incident was starting to wear off, but confusion remained. Why were Arab terrorists targeting me? Why was a Mossad agent protecting me? What was I supposed to do now? What is going on? I looked at her quizzically. "I suppose I don't understand. Shouldn't we inform the police or the FBI about what happened back there?" I asked. She gave me a stern look. "You still don't get it, do you? Why do you think that guy was waiting for you?" "I don't know," I said helplessly. "Only 2 days I was in Washington, and then I got ordered to come down here to Oak Ridge. I don't know how they knew I was here or why they want to harm me." "You don't have to be secretive around me," she said. "I know you work for the NSA. I also know the reason why your boss ordered you to fly down here on such short notice." I stiffened. "You mean you know about Ginny and—" She nodded. "We've known about her little connection with Amir for a while. I've listened to the tape of your wife's conversation, and several others as well." I grimaced in spite of myself. "It's bad enough when your wife is cheating on you. It's infinitely worse when you learn that everyone else knows all about it." Angrily, I snapped. "That still doesn't explain why I was ambushed like that." She took a deep breath. "Didn't you think it was odd that your boss would send you out of town like that?" she asked. "Didn't you think it was strange that they would want you to tell Ginny where you were going?" "They were trying to keep me from having to confront her," I said hotly. She shook her head like I was a slow child in her classroom. "They were trying to use you as bait to lure Amir away from Fort Meade," she said. "They wanted him to follow you. They didn't know what he was up to, and they wanted him as far away from the NSA as they could get him. They probably also thought that if he went after you, Henry could take him out. But Henry got careless when he drove you up to Frozen Head, and he managed to get himself killed in the process." "They were using me for bait?" I asked, growing angrier by the second at the thought. But before I think about it further, I noticed the first Oak Ridge exit flash by. "Weren't we supposed to get off there?" I asked. She shook her head. "That's the last place we want to go now. We've got to get you back to Fort Meade." I tried to digest that thought. "Are we going to catch a flight out of Knoxville?" She shook her head. "No planes, no credit cards, no cell phone calls. I can't take the risk of another interception attempt. We're going off the grid." "We're going to drive all the way back to Washington?" I asked in disbelief. She merely nodded. We hit rush hour traffic in Knoxville just then, and I kept quiet while Esther maneuvered through the congestion. But once we were past and speeding toward the Virginia border, I couldn't hold my questions any longer. "You never told me why the Mossad has been following me," I complained. "For that matter, you haven't told me why Al-Qaeda or whoever Amir is with is trying to harm me." Suddenly, a not unpleasant thought struck me. Wait, was that Amir who blew himself up along with Henry? She shook her head. "No such luck. That was actually Amir's brother, Hassan. He's another bad one, and I'm not sad he's gone, but Amir is the one we really want, preferably alive. Considering that Amir was the one sleeping with my wife, I wouldn't have minded if he were in pieces back there. So who is this Amir guy, and why does he have it in for me?" She took on a distinctly uncomfortable expression. Actually, that may have been partly our fault. You know that computer virus you've been working on for the past few weeks? Well, we were the ones who sent it to the NSA. I was appalled that she would know about that. I wasn't anything secret anymore. One of our people found it attached to a communication we intercepted in Tel Aviv. We haven't been able to figure out what it is or what it's supposed to do, but we think its target is something in the state of Israel. The only clue we have is what appears to be the name for the virus. Al-Andalus. This was the first I'd heard about any name. What is Al-Andalus? I asked. Is it some kind of code or someone's name? No, it's a name out of history. Back in the 700s, the Moors invaded Europe from North Africa. Over time, they managed to conquer Portugal, most of Spain, and even part of France. They named the region Al-Andalus, and various caliphates and emirates ruled it for much of the next 7 centuries. I stared at her dumbfounded. All this is about something that happened 1,300 years ago, she nodded grimly. I know it's hard to believe, but ISIS wants to re-establish the caliphate and restore Muslim rule over Al-Andalus. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard, I exclaimed. How can they possibly hope to do that? And anyway, that has nothing to do with me. I don't have any Spanish blood in me. I've never even been to Spain. You're looking at this from a Western perspective. Not from theirs, she said calmly. To ISIS, the loss of Al-Andalus was a humiliation that must be avenged, and they are prepared for a struggle that could last a century or more. They know they need the support of other Arabic countries, so their plan is to unite them by attacking the state of Israel. We think the Al-Andalus virus is the opening salvo in that campaign. Our experts believe this virus is some kind of highly sophisticated cyber attack on our defenses. But we couldn't crack it, so we passed it along to you. Why me? I'm just another hacker. I'm nothing special, I said. Don't sell yourself short, Esther said. We've been following your work and we know what you're capable of. More importantly, ISIS knows it too. And they're desperate to make sure nobody figures out a way to neutralize it. Why do you think they tried to get to you through Ginny? Why do you think Amir sent his brother after you when you were suddenly sent to the biggest, fastest computer system in the country? My boss never said anything about any of this, I protested. She shook her head in disgust. The NSA brass was never convinced the Al-Andalus virus was all that important, she said. We had to push hard to get them to assign it to you. Suddenly a memory hit me. Just before that guy blew himself up, he shouted something that I didn't understand. She was right there with me. Yes, he shouted, Al-Andalus. Now, do you believe me? I sat back in my seat and tried to take in everything I just learned. Another question came to mind, but before I could ask it, Esther abruptly turned off on the exit toward Johnson City. Where are you going? I asked, but instead of answering, she pulled off on the shoulder of the road and turned off the engine. Then her head slumped back against the seat rest. I don't think I can make it any farther, she said, and then to my horror, she passed out. I guess I panicked a little because I yelled at her and shook her, but she didn't wake up. I got out of the car, ran around to the driver's side, and pulled open the door. Then I saw the problem. The left sleeve of the leather jacket she was wearing had a jagged tear in it. I put my fingers inside, and when I pulled them out, they were covered in blood. I pulled her out from behind the wheel and managed to slide her into the back seat. Now what? In the distance, I could see a sign for a motel, and not knowing what else to do, I drove down to it. An old man was working behind what passed for the reception desk, and remembering what Esther had said, I paid cash for a room for the night. When I went back to the car, I found Esther sitting up in the back seat. Evidently, she had managed to rinse her arm off in the bathroom, but it was still oozing blood into the towel she'd brought with her. She took a couple of the ibuprofen tablets first, then had me clean and rinse off the wound with the alcohol. I knew that had to hurt, but she didn't make a sound. When I had cleaned it out as best I could, she looked up at me and said, "Hand me my knife." I couldn't figure out why she wanted her combat knife, but I fished it out of her pocket and gave it to her anyway. "Okay," she said, taking a deep breath. "Now I need you to stitch up the wound." "Wait a minute," I protested. "I've never done anything like that." I don't know how she looked at me grimly. "If you don't sew it up, it's going to continue to bleed, and I could go into shock." "Don't worry, I'll walk you through it." Reluctantly, I threaded the needle and knotted the thread at the end. When I was ready, she picked up her knife, put the handle in her mouth, and bit down on the rubberized grip. With a gulp, I started trying to sew up the wound. I heard her gasp and whimper around the knife, and once she took it out of her mouth to tell me to pull the stitches tighter. Several times I thought I was going to be sick, but seeing her courage shamed me into pressing on until the job was finished. When I'd tied off the thread, I smeared the antibiotic cream all over the wound. She spat out the knife and looked down at my makeshift surgery. "Not bad for an amateur," she said, and then fainted. That frightened me, but her breathing and pulse seemed normal. I propped her on her back and used a spare pillow to elevate her feet. Then I covered her up with a blanket and waited. After a few minutes, her eyes fluttered open. When she saw me, she smiled slightly. "Don't worry, Thomas. I'm all right now. I just feel very weak. Let me rest for a little while, and I'll be fine." Then she closed her eyes. Once Esther's breathing indicated she had fallen back asleep, exhaustion washed over me. The failed assassination attempt, Henry's death, the shocking revelations I had heard, and the impromptu surgery I performed on Esther had drained all of my remaining energy. I got up, turned off the lights in our room, and sat down. I kicked off my shoes and placed my keys and wallet on the nightstand. I didn't have any other options for sleeping, except for the floor, which I didn't think I could handle. So, I quietly slipped into bed beside Esther and fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. December 29th, when I woke up, I realized that the sky was bright. I felt embarrassed as I noticed that I had cuddled up to Esther with my arm around her waist. I gently pulled my arm away, hoping not to wake her. I didn't want her to get the wrong idea. Since she still seemed to be asleep, I put on my shoes, grabbed my wallet and keys, and went to the car to find some food for both of us. Thankfully, there was a fast food place near the drugstore I had found the previous night. I was able to get a bag of breakfast sandwiches and a couple of large coffees. When I returned to our motel, Esther was awake and sitting up in bed. She asked me to change the bandage on her arm, so I did. I was relieved to see that the bleeding had stopped and that there were no signs of infection. After that, I helped her put her sweater back on. It was a little challenging to be so close to a partially dressed female, but I made sure not to do anything that could hurt or offend her. Both Esther and I were hungry, so we eagerly devoured the sandwiches. As we sipped our coffee, Esther glanced at me curiously and said, "I didn't know Ginny had a tattoo she doesn't." I responded, "What made you think that?" I woke up during the night and had to go to the bathroom. When I returned to bed, I noticed your wallet had fallen open to a picture of her. It looked like she had a tattoo on her neck. My spirits sank suddenly. "That's an old picture," I said flatly. "And it's not a tattoo, it's a birthmark." Esther seemed to pick up on my tone and raised her eyebrows. "Want to tell me about it?" Ginny and I went to the same high school. She was smart, cute, and thin, and I was madly in love with her. However, I was shy and nerdy, so I could never gather the courage to ask her out. Unfortunately, Ginny was born with a birthmark on her neck. She was very self-conscious about it, and the other kids would relentlessly tease her. One day, as I was walking down the hall, I saw a group of them surrounding her and taunting her. They called her birthmark Ginny Jelly, and she was crying. Without thinking, I sprinted towards them, my fists clenched and my face red and distorted with rage. "Leave her alone," I shouted at the top of my lungs. "You stay away from her. She's beautiful, and you're just too ignorant to see it. Any of those guys could have easily beaten me up." But I was so furious that I didn't care, and that seemed to intimidate them. Finally, one of the girls on the outskirts of the group tugged on a guy's arm and said, "Come on, leave her alone." Suddenly, the group of bullies dispersed. I turned to Ginny, who was watching everything through red, teary eyes. "Come on," I said, "let's skip class and get out of here for a while." I led her out to the football field, and we climbed up into the stands. "Why did you say that, Thomas?" she asked hesitantly. "Why did you say I was beautiful?" "Because you are, Ginny," I said earnestly. "You think your birthmark makes you look ugly, but I think it makes you unique and special." "But it's ugly," she insisted. "I see it every day in the mirror, and I hate it." "That's where you're wrong," I insisted. "You look at yourself, and all you see is the mark. I look at you, and I see a beautiful and special girl. You focus on your birthmark, I see the entirety of who you are." She looked at me in amazement, and then suddenly leaned over and hugged me. That was the beginning of our relationship. We ended up going to college together and getting married after we graduated. However, Ginny never truly believed that she was beautiful. That birthmark on her neck always bothered her, so she would try to conceal it with makeup or hide it with the clothes she wore. After we graduated and she got a job, she wanted to use her income to have the birthmark removed. I loved her just the way she was, but she was determined and sought a specialist who could perform laser treatments. The doctor informed her that the treatments were highly effective and could nearly eliminate the birthmark. However, there was a catch. Ginny would need 8 to 10 treatments, with several months of healing required between each one. It was an expensive process that insurance wouldn't cover. Regardless, Ginny was incredibly excited about the prospect of erasing her birthmark, and nothing else mattered to her. Ginny finished the treatments about a year ago, and they completely transformed her outlook on life. Her self-confidence soared, and she became more flirtatious and outgoing. She also started wearing more revealing clothing now that she didn't have to hide her birthmark on her shoulder and neck. Of course, this caught the attention of other guys. I wasn't thrilled about it, but Ginny loved the attention. She told me it felt amazing to have people admire her instead of pity her. Although her newfound mindset bothered me, I kept my concerns to myself since I wanted Ginny to be happy. It didn't work out well for me in the end. Esther looked at me silently for a while, and I assumed she thought I was weak. However, she surprised me by saying, "Thomas, you're an interesting man. You're not what I expected at all." Then she stood up abruptly. "We need to get back on the road. The morning is almost over, and we still have a long drive ahead of us." Even though Esther claimed her arm was feeling better, she still wasn't comfortable driving. So I took the wheel once more. We quickly left Tennessee behind and crossed over into Virginia, but we still had nearly 8 hours of driving left. As we traveled north on I-81, I glanced over at Esther. "So, what do you know about the Al-Andalus virus, and why are your people so concerned about it?" I asked. She was all business now. "Our team has been studying it ever since we discovered it, but we haven't made any progress. Initially, we thought it was a program meant to steal passwords, secret documents, or confidential information. The problem is that the virus doesn't do anything. We've isolated different types of computers and deliberately infected them, but the virus only runs for a brief moment before shutting itself down." "If it's not doing anything, why are you so worried?" I questioned. "There are 3 reasons," she explained. "Firstly, we've never seen anything like it before. It appears to be highly complex and sophisticated. No one would go through so much effort for something harmless. The second reason is the amount of suspicious activity we've detected from ISIS. Everything we've heard implies that something significant is about to happen, although we don't know the specifics or the timing. Lastly, there's you." "Me?" I asked, surprised. "Exactly," she replied. "When we directed this virus to you, we noticed a sudden spike in activity, followed by complete silence. Then, the next thing we know, 2 dangerous individuals start pursuing you." "Emir and his brother," I said bitterly. "That's right," she affirmed. "When you put it all together, it seems Al-Andalus is crucial to ISIS's plans. We need to understand its purpose and figure out how to stop it." "So when we return to DC, should we head straight to Fort Meade?" I suggested. Esther shook her head and affirmed, "No, I highly doubt they'll allow me inside with you," she said. "They might even deny you entry after what happened in Oak Ridge. Instead of risking a long delay, I think it would be better for you to tackle the virus from your home computer. You have secure access to the NSA network, right?" I confirmed that I did, and we made that our plan. The only downside to working from home was the potential encounter with Ginny. After learning everything I didn't feel ready to face her yet. Besides, it would only serve as a distraction from focusing on the virus. My confrontation with my wife would have to happen later. I did my best to make up for lost time, but we encountered various delays along the way. Between bathroom breaks, lunch, and Esther's worsening arm wound, we kept losing precious time. Eventually, I pulled off the interstate at Harrisonburg to find a drugstore. I drove past a couple of chain stores until I came across an old-fashioned family-owned drugstore. The pharmacist on duty was a woman, and when I showed her Esther's arm, she expressed great sympathy. "I'm trying to get my wife to our family doctor in DC," I explained, "but I'm not sure if she can hold on until we get there." The woman went back among the shelves and reappeared with a little white envelope. "Here's a pain reliever," she told me. "It's a combination of acetaminophen and hydrocodone. I can't give you more than one without a prescription. but this should help your wife till you can get home. I'd recommend she have something to eat before she takes it." I thanked the druggist profusely for her kindness, and we climbed back into the car. Esther wanted to hold off a little before she took the medicine in case it made her sleepy, so I drove another hour until we reached the turnoff to I-66 and stopped in Front Royal. By then it was after 8 p.m., and we were both hungry. We found a funny little burger joint called Spelunkers, I guess because of Skyline Caverns, and we had burgers and fries, which were surprisingly good. Esther took the pain reliever with her meal, and it seemed to hit her almost right away because she started to get drowsy right after we finished. I was worn out too, so it was obvious to me that we weren't going to make it home that night. There was a Super 8 motel almost right across the street, so after we finished our meal I drove the car over there and got us a room. I helped Esther inside, and she fell asleep only minutes after she hit the bed. That left me to sit around in the darkened room, and once again my mind started revisiting everything that had happened. In only a few days my whole life had been turned upside down. And the person who had caused all this chaos was none other than my wife Ginny, the woman I had loved without reservation and for whom I would have gladly given my life before all this started. Betrayal, I thought, has to be the worst sin. When you love and trust someone only to discover that they aren't equally committed, it shakes the very foundations of your being. I felt so many emotions that I couldn't even identify them all. The only thing I knew for sure was that Ginny was the last person I wanted to see. The more I thought about the possibility of encountering her, the more upset I got until I did something I shouldn't have done. I went outside, turned on my cell phone and called Ginny's number, hoping that she wouldn't answer. Sure enough, the call rolled over to her voicemail, and hearing her recorded message brought my emotions quickly to the boiling point. "It's me, Ginny," I said, trying hard not to yell at her. "Listen, I know all about you, about your affair with Amir. I heard what you'd like to do with him when you're stuck at home with me, and it made me sick. I can't believe you betrayed me like that, after all I've done for you, and especially after all the things you said to me about faithfulness." I realized my voice was rising, and I took a deep breath to try to calm myself. "Anyway, I'll be home tomorrow, and I don't want you there. Go to your boyfriend's house or to your parents, or go to heck for all I care. Just stay away from our house, because the only time I want to see you again is in divorce court." I wanted to say more, something to convey all the hurt and anger I felt, but I couldn't come up with anything clever, so I hung up. At that moment, I wished I had an old-fashioned phone with a receiver so I could slam it down. I was still pretty upset, so I walked east along South Street for a little way and then retraced my steps. When I got back to our room, Esther was still sleeping. I looked at her and wondered what she was really like. Did she have a boyfriend back in Israel? Did she cheat on him? I shook my head, trying to dispel my dark thoughts. At least she had saved my life. And even though I knew she wanted my help, she hadn't hesitated to put herself in harm's way for me. That had to count for something. I lay down beside her. Even through the covers, I could feel the warmth of her body, and it felt good. Then I realized that I was likely to be sleeping alone for a long time to come. On that sad note, I drifted off to sleep. December 30th, the continental breakfast the motel offered wasn't much, but it fueled us enough to get us on our way. Esther told me that her arm was feeling a lot better, but when we were ready to leave, I got back behind the wheel. Besides, I knew the way to my home in College Park. It took us another hour and a half to get to Washington, and then we had to drive halfway around the Beltway. But once we made it to College Park, the traffic dropped off significantly. With all the University of Maryland students gone for Christmas break, the streets were almost deserted. I drove through our neighborhood warily, but when I went by my house, it appeared that Ginny had gotten my warning because her car was not in the driveway. I circled around the block once and then parked. Inside the house was a mess, but I ignored it. I sure didn't feel like I had to apologize to Esther for Ginny's sloppy housekeeping. We had turned our formal dining room into a home office, and I led Esther in there and began booting up my computer. But before I could log on to the NSA network, I heard a key in the lock of the front door. Darn it, I cursed. I told her not to come here. I ran to the door and yanked it open. There was Ginny, tears pouring down her face. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm sorry," she blubbered. Before I could say anything, she was shoved forward into my arms, and as I automatically tried to catch her, a man suddenly emerged from behind the frame of the door and barged into the house. "What in the heck?" I yelled. But then I saw the big black automatic he was pointing at me, and I stopped abruptly. Esther had rushed up behind us. "Get back," the man said menacingly, brandishing his gun to include all three of us. After slamming the door shut, his face took on a grin of triumph as he stared at us. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Amir Nasir," he gestured at me. "And you must be the naive fool," he said with a sneer. Then his eyes caught sight of Esther and his smile widened. "And who have we here?" "I do believe it's the exceptional Esther Freeman, the Mossad agent." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Esther tense, and I realized that she was about to spring. Amir must have seen it too, because he shifted his gun to aim at her. No, he warned her. "Don't even think about it. You would die even if you managed to get my gun." Then he pulled open his jacket, and we all could see the vest he wore under it. "One wrong move and I blow us all away. Me to paradise and you three to damnation." Esther relaxed her muscles while Ginny and I stood there, paralyzed by fear. "Very well," Amir said with a sneer. "Let's see how much you've learned about our little surprise." With that, he stepped into my home office, turned to my computer, and moved the mouse to clear the screensaver. When it did so, the flat screen revealed the login page for the NSA network. "The password," he said. "Give it to me." "No," I said flatly. I was hoping that keeping him in the dark about our progress might give us some leverage with him. "So, the fool wants to show he has some courage after all," he laughed. "I wonder what it will take for me to convince you to cooperate." I saw Esther stand up a little straighter, and I realized that she was fully prepared to die. But Amir laughed again. "No, she is a soldier, and I think you know that all soldiers must be prepared to die sooner or later. I don't think her death will motivate you." Suddenly, he swung the gun towards Ginny. "So how about this one?" he asked rhetorically. "I wonder if you still have enough feelings left for her to want to prevent her death." Amir, Ginny shrieked. "You can't mean it. Not after everything we've done." Amir's face contorted into a look of distaste and contempt. "Be silent. You are nothing to me, simply another Western person ready to dishonor her husband at the first opportunity." Then he turned back to me, and his face took on a sly smile. "But I don't think I'll harm her. What if I merely injure her? Say shoot off one of those body parts she likes to flaunt." Ginny uselessly clasped her hands across her chest and began to sob piteously, but Amir kept his eyes on me the whole time. Darn it, I was so angry at her for betraying me, but I still didn't want to see her tortured. I couldn't shake off years of protecting her that easily. All right, I said, "don't shoot her. I'll give you the password." "Much better," he said, turning away from Ginny and back toward the keyboard. What is it, his hands, I thought. I've got to capture his hands. Suddenly, I had a crazy idea. If it didn't work, he would probably hurt me on the spot. But then I thought, he'll probably hurt me anyway, once he's certain that I haven't figured out how to disable his virus. "I don't have it memorized," I told him. "I used the product code written on that metal cube on the bookshelf." "You really are a nerd," he said with contempt as he picked the cube up and examined it. It was made of a flat silvery metal about an inch on each side. "But that's only half the password," I said breathlessly. "The other half is on the second cube over here," I said, pointing at a wooden cabinet behind me. Now his suspicions were fully alerted, and I could almost feel the spot on my chest where his gun was aimed. "Pick it up and show it to me slowly now," he directed. Being careful not to make any sudden moves, I picked up the cube off the wooden shelf and held it up for him to see. It was identical to the one he held. "Do you want me to bring it to you?" I asked. "No," he snapped quickly. "Place it on the floor and slide it over to me with your foot. Gently." Ginny was still crying, and Esther was watching me with a curious expression as I knelt down, placed the cube on the floor, and gave it a shove toward him with my shoe. "Now back up, all of you," he snarled. When we were back against the far wall, he put his gun down with an easy reach, knelt and grabbed the second cube in his right hand while still holding the first one in his left. Then he stood and brought the two up to examine them. But to his astonishment and ours, his hands seemed to accelerate towards each other and slam together with so much force that I heard the bones in his fingers fracture. Amir screamed in pain and sank to his knees, desperately trying to pull his hands apart. I ran at him somewhat clumsily and bumped into him with my shoulder, causing him to fall to the floor. Esther arrived just seconds later and kneed him in the head with force. She did it a second time and Amir lost consciousness. "Do you have any tape?" she yelled at me. I quickly opened one of the desk drawers and grabbed some duct tape. In no time, we had Amir's arms and legs securely bound together, with his fingers still caught between the magnetic cubes. After Esther finished wrapping his legs, she turned to me with a puzzled expression. "What were those cubes?" "I've never seen anything like them before," she asked. I blushed a little and apologized. "It's kind of a geeky thing." "They're neodymium magnets," I explained. "They're really strong rare earth magnets. I bought them out of curiosity but never really used them because they intimidated me. Each magnet has a pulling force of about 140 pounds. It was the only way I could think of to prevent him from detonating that dangerous vest." "Oh wow, no wonder he couldn't break free." "I almost feel sorry for him," she said, surprised. I wasn't sure if it would work, I confessed, but I felt like I had to give it a try. Esther didn't say anything, but she looked at me with a thoughtful gaze. Suddenly, we heard a loud thud and the front door was kicked open. Several men stormed into the house, carrying assault rifles. "FBI," one of them shouted. "Everyone get down on the ground with your hands up." It took some time for the agents to figure out who we all were. Once they confirmed our identities, they focused their attention on Amir. First, they carefully removed the martyr's vest he was wearing and disarmed it. One of the agents gasped. This would have blown up the entire house if he had triggered it, he marveled. Only then did they remove the tape from the terrorist and attempt to separate his hands. It took 2 agents to break them apart, and the pain woke him up. He made a quick attempt to reach for the trigger on his vest, only to realize it was gone and he was rendered helpless. He initially slumped back in defeat, but then he turned his head to stare at Esther and me. "You may think you've won, but you're mistaken. Even if you knew what to look for, it's too late to stop what's going to happen. My life doesn't matter. The caliphate will rise as it did before." "Al-Andalus," he shouted, his teeth grinding into a smile like grimace. I heard a small crack, followed by the odor of bitter almonds. "Oh no," one of the agents exclaimed. "He's taken poison." The medic who was attending to Amir's hands shouted at his partner, "Amyl nitrite stat. Hold it under his nose and try to get him to inhale it," but Amir went into convulsions and stopped breathing completely within 2 minutes. "Cyanide," the medic cursed. "He must have had a fake tooth." The last time I heard of someone using one of those was in the 20th century. Once Amir was placed in a body bag and taken away in an ambulance, there was only one more dramatic incident. An agent walked over to Ginny and politely asked, "Are you Virginia Selfridge?" Ginny nodded, and he said, "Mrs. Selfridge, you are under arrest as an accomplice to murder and terrorism." He proceeded to read her the Miranda rights as she gasped and protested. No, I had no idea he was a terrorist. I had nothing to do with any of this," she cried. However, the agent ignored her pleas and calmly handcuffed her. Tears rolling down her face, she turned to me with fear in her eyes. "Thomas, please help me. You have to do something. Make them understand that I wasn't involved. Amir deceived me." I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. "Sorry, Ginny, I can't assist you. You brought this upon yourself. Next time, choose your partner in a more responsible and faithful manner." As the agent led my sobbing wife out of the room, I approached another agent. "Will they really charge her as an accomplice?" I asked. "Nah," he replied. "We know she's only guilty of being naive and unfaithful, no offense. But we're going to thoroughly investigate her over the next few days to gather as much information as possible about Amir, his methods, his network, and anything else we can think of. I don't think her New Year's is going to start off very pleasantly." Satisfied with his answer, I turned to Esther. The medic was examining the shrapnel wound on her arm. "This will be painful for a while," he said, "but I don't see any signs of infection and I believe it'll heal just fine once it's fully treated." Then he winked at her discreetly, a gesture I wasn't supposed to notice, and added, "However, if I were you, I'd consider filing a complaint about the person who stitched you up. Those are the worst sutures I've ever seen." Esther looked at me, touched my hand, and smiled. "I'll definitely take that into consideration," she replied. Then her expression shifted, and she stood up to search for the agent in charge. When she found him, she requested an escort to Fort Meade. Now that we no longer have to worry about Amir, we need to tackle Al-Andalus as quickly as possible, and we'll need all the support we can get. It seemed that the agent in charge had already notified the people at NSA headquarters in Fort Meade about the situation, because we were greeted with respect when we arrived. An armed guard led us to a high-security elevator that took us straight to the top floor. From there, we were escorted to the NSA director's office, a place I never imagined I would visit. Alongside the director, we were introduced to high-ranking representatives from the FBI and the CIA. I'm way out of my league here, I thought to myself. Esther and I were asked to recount the events leading up to the present moment. Once we finished, the others provided additional details and new intelligence about the situation. The consensus was that the three agencies all believed a major terrorist attack, codenamed Al-Andalus, was imminent. They suspected New Year's Eve as the most likely date, with Israel being the primary target, though there were other potential targets as well. Furthermore, they all agreed that the computer virus we had been investigating played a crucial role. However, no one reached a consensus on anything, and the group started to argue. At one point, the CIA representative motioned for Esther to join him, and the two of them briefly left the director's office. When they returned, Esther had a peculiar expression on her face. She leaned over and whispered, "I just had an interesting phone call. We managed to get the head of Mossad out of bed. I've been instructed to stay with you and assist in any way I can." Before I could respond, the NSA director addressed me. "Mr. Selfridge, I've been informed that you have a talent for solving puzzles like this. I've also been told that you've been working on deciphering the Al-Andalus virus for some time now. Furthermore, we know that the Islamic State was so concerned about what you might uncover that they assigned 2 of their top agents to stop you. With all that in mind, I'm asking you to assemble a team to crack this code and stop its objectives. Whatever resources you need from the NSA are at your disposal." He paused and glanced at Esther. "I've also been informed that the head of Mossad would like MS. Freeman to be part of your team. Is that correct, MS?" Freeman. When Esther nodded, the director stood up. "The rest of us have a lot to do, but I believe it's best if you two get back to working on that virus as soon as possible." He must have signaled someone, because a man entered the room and led us to a working area on a lower floor. He pointed at the computer terminals and encrypted telephone stations, inviting us to make ourselves comfortable. "I'll be right outside the door if you need any assistance," he assured us. The room we were given wasn't an ordinary meeting space. The walls were lined with television screens, each displaying the name of a different city around the world. Below each screen, a clock showed the local time. "Look," Esther pointed out, "it's 5:30 in the afternoon on the 30th here," she said, "but in Israel, New Year's Eve has already begun. If the attack is set for midnight, our time is running out." I sat down at a terminal and opened the work I had already done on the virus. The code scrolled down the screen, and I tried various techniques to decipher it, but my usual hacking tools proved ineffective. I immersed myself in my work, losing all track of time. Someone brought sandwiches, and I absent-mindedly took a small bite without even recognizing the flavor. Eventually, my tired eyes began to sting, and I rested my head on the desk to rest them for a moment. December 31st, I woke up to Esther shaking my shoulder. I looked at her with confusion, and she simply pointed at the Tel Aviv clock. It showed 1 p.m. on December 31st. I glanced at the other screens and saw that it was 6 a.m. in Washington. Suddenly, the sound of explosions came from one of the TV monitors, but I realized that it was the New Zealand feed, not Israel. They were fireworks, not the sounds of warfare. Understanding slowly dawned on me, and I looked at Esther anxiously. "It's already midnight in Auckland. New Year's Eve has already started there. Time is running out." I glanced down at the computer monitor, but the code appeared just as confusing as before. It was clear that the virus was designed to target a specific operating system, but with countless proprietary systems in use worldwide, it seemed impossible to determine which one. The only person likely to recognize the system code would be someone who regularly worked with it. We needed to try a different approach. I turned to Esther and said, "Maybe we should take a break from cracking the code and focus on understanding the intentions of the perpetrators. If we can guess their objective, it might lead us to a clue on how to tackle the code. Let's start with the basics. Bad guys often use viruses to steal important information like account numbers, passwords, or other confidential data. Stealing state secrets might create big problems, but I can't see how that would help ISIS all that much." Besides, from what I've read, that kind of espionage is only really effective if the enemy doesn't know you have penetrated their security. She nodded in agreement. Our people think the same thing. We believe ISIS wants some big, impactful event, something on the scale of 9 to 11. Okay, let's say that they were able to knock down the tallest building in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. How would that help them re-establish their influence, I asked. If they bombed the Knesset or caused some similar disaster? She said, it would certainly send shock waves throughout the nation. But that wouldn't do anything to weaken the Israeli military, and ISIS has to know that we'd retaliate with everything we have. Surely those people wouldn't want that. I agree, I said. Another conflict in the Middle East would be disruptive. But so far none of them have turned out very well for the Arabs, I said. If I were them, my goal would be a decisive blow, something that would take Israel out of the equation completely. Put yourself in their shoes. What could do that? Esther and I brainstormed for a few minutes, then her face paled. If I were ISIS, I know what my target would be. Dimona. The nuclear site in the Negev desert, I asked. Exactly, she said. If they could manage to destroy it, they could turn the state of Israel into another Chernobyl. That scenario was horrifying to me, but Esther seemed to regain her composure. I can't tell you the details, she said, but that place is heavily guarded and defended. There's no way they could even get close to it, much less destroy it. Just then, the live feed from Sydney showed fireworks bursting over the iconic Opera House as the Earth continued its inevitable march toward a new year. I started to look away, but then I stared again at the scene. The soaring fireworks gave me the answer. The Patriots, I yelled. The virus is targeted at the Patriot missiles. I rushed to the door of our room and found our contact outside. We need someone from whoever manufactures the Patriot missile system, I yelled. Get them here fast, fly them in if you have to. While we waited, Esther got on the phone and called Tel Aviv. Most of her conversation was in Hebrew, so I didn't understand what she was saying, but the conversation got pretty heated at times. Afterwards, I asked her what was going on. The Israeli Defense Force is convinced that their system hasn't been breached and there's nothing wrong with Yahalom. What's Yahalom? I asked. That's our name for the Patriot system, she said. They think we're chasing rumors. I went online and tried to find information about the Patriot system. As I was scanning various links, the door opened and a young man wearing a jacket with a Raytheon logo came into the room. We make the Patriot system, he said cheerfully. What do you need? I quickly explained our hypothesis and showed him the computer terminal and the virus we had found. He looked at it for a few minutes and the bored expression on his face disappeared. Quickly, he pulled a laptop out of his bag and began checking lines of code. After a few minutes, he looked up at us and said, "Oh, no, what is it?" Esther demanded. "This is bad, really bad," he said. He pointed at his laptop. "This is the operating system for the Patriot's EN/MPQ-65 radar tracking system." He pointed at the computer terminal I'd been using. "That virus you have has been written to alter the intercept data the radar uploads to the missile. It's not a big change, but at the speed and distance needed for an intercept, it will cause the Patriot to completely miss its intended target." I turned to Esther. "Get back to the IDF and tell them we have confirmation that the virus targets the Patriots. Then get them to check the operating systems again to see if they've been infected." I turned back to the Raytheon technician. "Don't go anywhere, we're going to need you." Then I got on the phone and called the director's office. They put me straight through. "Sir, we now have confirmation that the virus attacks the Patriot missile system. We don't know for sure, but we think the target is Israel, possibly the Dimona nuclear site." "Yes, sir. Our next priority is to try to figure out how to stop it." Esther had also been on the phone, and when I hung up, she was looking at me with an angry expression. "That'll teach those people to pay attention," she said. "They've already found signs of the Al-Andalus virus in one of the Patriot installations, and they're checking the others now." The Raytheon technician chimed in, "Oh, they'll find it for sure. All the systems are designed to communicate with one another. That way they create a strong defense. If one of them is infected, you can bet they all are." Esther and I stared at each other. "So how do we fix it?" I asked him. "Well, I've never heard of one of our systems having a virus, but theoretically it should be pretty simple to fix. All you'd have to do is replace the NMPQ on each of the missile batteries with a new one." "Can't you just install a new operating system?" I asked. "These systems aren't like a Mac or a PC," he said. The hardware and software are integrated, you've got different parts working together. The only way to be sure you've got a clean system is a replacement. Okay, how long does that take, I asked. Oh, anywhere from 8 to 12 hours, that's cutting it close, Esther said. Of course, that doesn't count delivery time, the technician added. Delivery from where, I asked uneasily. From our plant in Andover, Massachusetts, he said. I slumped back into my chair and looked despairingly at Esther. That won't work, I said. I turned back to the guy from Raytheon. You and I are going to have to figure out something else, I said. We worked on the problem for hours. I tried to educate him on how viruses worked, and he tried to teach me about the Patriot system. We didn't make much progress. More software engineers from Raytheon showed up, and I began moving between them, trying to find a solution. The problem was that their system was specific to the Patriot unit, and they had never encountered a virus aimed at their system. They had no way to attack the problem. The easy solution would be to replace the units, but it would take too long and leave their defense vulnerable. We'd basically be doing ISIS's work for them. The first engineer began to get frustrated. If you're worried about a missile attack, your best bet is to destroy the missiles on the ground before they ever get launched. Neutralize the immediate threat, and you can replace the Patriot tracking system at your leisure. Esther stood up and confronted him. In Gulf War I, back in 1991, the Iraqis fired Scud missiles at Israel to try to draw us into the war and divide the coalition. The coalition Air Force diverted dozens of planes to hunt for and destroy the missiles before they could be fired. For the most part, they failed because the missiles were on hidden trucks in the desert. That was over 20 years ago, when the missiles were large and conspicuous. The latest missiles are smaller, harder to find, and easier to launch. So stop wasting time and get back to work. Yes, ma'am, he gulped and turned back to his monitor while I tried to hide my smile. The situation was tense, but I couldn't help but be impressed with Esther's determination. Just then she grabbed my arm and pointed at the screen with the live feed from Tel Aviv. It's midnight, she gasped. Everyone in the room stopped and watched nervously. Esther leaned over and whispered, "The IDF is on full alert, and I've been told that your military is also in a high state of readiness, but the scenes from Tel Aviv revealed nothing more than the normal New Year's Eve celebrations." Esther told me with relief that Dimona reported no activity at all. After that, the Raytheon team wanted to go home, but we wouldn't let them leave. There's too much at stake, Esther said, and the little group reluctantly went back to work. After a while, one of them raised his head and asked, "Does anybody know what's so special about 1.492? I looked at him with a puzzled expression. "Nothing that I can think of. Why do you ask?" "Because that's the deviation the virus adds into the targeting data to divert the missiles," he said. "It just seems like such a precise number. I wondered if it had any significance." One of the other technicians chimed in. 1492? I know what that stands for. Then, to our surprise, he began to sing the childhood rhyme in 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Everybody in the room laughed except for Esther, who got a strange look on her face. Quickly, she went to one of the computers and did some quick checking. "That's it," she yelled. We all looked at her in confusion, so she quickly explained. "Everybody knows that King Ferdinand of Spain and Queen Isabella commissioned Christopher Columbus's expedition in 1492. But most of us in the West have forgotten the other major event in 1492. That was also the year that the last emir surrendered Granada to Queen Isabella, bringing an end to Al-Andalus." Then her face paled and she went back to the computer. "Oh my gosh, look at this," she gasped. The date the emir surrendered was January 2nd. "Thomas, the attack was never planned for New Year's Eve. It's coming the day after. ISIS wants revenge for that disgrace. I'll bet they're planning to launch their campaign to retake Al-Andalus on the same date." The Raytheon guys were looking at her as though she was speaking a foreign language, but it sounded entirely plausible to me. Esther immediately got on the phone to call Tel Aviv, and I got our liaison to take me back up to the director's office. After I had explained what we'd discovered, he nodded his head thoughtfully. "From what I know of these people, I think you're right. They never forget old grudges, and they would love nothing better than to pull off a coup on the anniversary of that defeat." He started to pick up his phone but stopped to look at me. "Now you and your team have to figure out a way to stop them." When I got back to our war room, The Raytheon engineers were huddled around one of the terminals. They had managed to establish a secure link between Fort Meade and Andover, and they were now online with a test version of the Patriot fire control guidance system. The next few hours were spent trying to find a way to root out the virus. But the system designers had never contemplated having to do surgery on the Patriot's operating system, and they had no way to isolate the affected areas. It's like an epidemic, one of the techs moaned. It's spread throughout the system and it's out of control. January 1st, while we worked feverishly, New Year's Day in Israel proceeded without incident. Although Esther and I were relieved that her prediction had been right, it just meant we were that much closer to the time we thought the real attack would begin. Finally, the head of Raytheon's technical team came to me. We've been over and over this thing. There are only two things we can do. The first is to shut down all the units that have been infected and wipe their entire software systems completely, including all peripherals. Then we'll load software we know is clean, boot them up and test them. But that's a time-consuming process, and even then we can't be sure that the new load won't get contaminated somewhere along the line. I shook my head and turned to Esther in frustration. We can try that, but I don't think we can get the job finished in time before midnight rolls around again in Israel. Besides, we don't want to take the entire Dimona defense system offline that long. What if the attack comes early? She looked defeated, and I felt like I had failed. I turned back to the Raytheon people. Isn't there anything else we can try? Some sort of error-checking routine that would recognize the problem and stop the virus? The poor guy shook his head apologetically. When the system was developed, the possibility of a virus was never considered. Now, this darn disease has infected the entire system, and we just don't have any antibiotic to kill it or vaccine to block it. I started to speak, but the words stuck in my throat as an idea from the past came to mind. Smallpox, I cried. When he looked at me in confusion, I went on. The way you fight smallpox is with cowpox, a weaker form of the same disease. We may not be able to kill the virus, I said with growing excitement. But what if we inoculate the system with another virus? The group looked at me skeptically. Listen, I said, we have a virus that has infected the Patriot system and causes it to produce faulty target data that's off by exactly plus 1.492 degrees. What if we write a second virus exactly like Al-Andalus, except that our version would direct the Patriot to adjust its targeting by minus 1.492 degrees? Wouldn't the two of them cancel each other out? The software engineers began to argue among themselves, heatedly debating the idea. After 20 minutes, the head of the team turned back to me. Some of our guys think it might work, but the rest of us are doubtful. How do we know the two viruses won't cause a bigger problem? How do we know they can coexist at the same time? We don't even know that we can successfully infect the Patriot system a second time. We won't have time to test it properly. Listen, guys, I said, we already know the original virus is both highly contagious and likely to be very effective. If we create a virus that's identical to the first one except with reciprocal values inserted, it's got to work. Besides, what other option do we have? There was a lot more discussion, but finally the group grudgingly conceded that creating an Al-Andalus antivirus was the best chance we had. They set about creating the antivirus, carefully checking and rechecking to make sure that everything except the target values was absolutely identical. While they were working, Esther grabbed my arm and looked at me with worried eyes. Are you sure this will work, Thomas? If you're wrong. I looked at her and suddenly I felt the same emotions I'd had back in high school when those bullies were attacking Ginny. This was what I believed in, and I wasn't going to back down. This is the right thing to do, I said fiercely. I'm sure of it. She looked in my eyes for a moment and then said, I believe you. The next few hours were a blur. Some members of the team checked and double-checked the new antivirus while others made arrangements to transmit the code to technicians on the ground in Israel. Those people, in turn, got set up to reinfect the Patriot systems and then test them to ensure the antivirus had taken. Meanwhile, as the clock moved closer to midnight in Tel Aviv, Esther and I spent the time in seemingly endless meetings with dozens of people, all of whom were highly skeptical of our plan. Finally, we wound up back in the director's office, where, after a long and sometimes heated debate, he looked at his counterparts in other branches of the government and said, unless someone else is prepared to implement another solution in the next hour, let's stop talking and start taking action. It was obvious that the others weren't satisfied, but they really had no other options. After the meeting broke up, the director came over to Esther and me and said in a quiet voice, "I hope you know what you're doing, for all our sakes." There wasn't anything I could say, so I simply nodded and the director seemed to accept that. He motioned to us. "All right then, you two have ridden this horse this far. You deserve to see it through to the end. Come with me." With that, he led us to the roof of the building, where a helicopter was waiting with its engines idling. We climbed on board and the bird immediately took off. I'd never ridden in a helicopter before and found it pretty unnerving, but Esther wasn't fazed a bit. That reminded me again how little I knew about her. After a few minutes, I looked out the window and spotted the unmistakable shape of our destination, the Pentagon. This was certainly a week full of firsts for me. I'd never been to the Pentagon before either. Soon enough, we landed on one of the helipads and were immediately escorted deep into the inner rings of the command center of U.S. military might. An armed guard was waiting beside a nondescript door, and when we approached, he opened it and motioned us inside. The room we entered was a long rectangle. Most of the center was taken up by a large oval table. The seats were arranged to face a huge flat-screen monitor that filled the wall at the far end of the room. Seated at the table were more generals, admirals, and other high-ranking officials than I had ever seen in my life. Esther and I were shown to one of the chairs that lined the side walls. Across the room, I spotted the director who'd ordered me to Oak Ridge. He quickly looked away when he saw me staring at him. After a few minutes, the lights were dimmed and everyone turned to face the giant flat screen. At first, the only light came from two time displays on the bottom of the screen. One showed Washington, D.C., the other Tel Aviv. Esther whispered anxiously, "It's almost midnight in Israel." Suddenly, the big screen filled with a God's eye view of the earth, but I couldn't figure out what I was seeing. Then the screen blinked and suddenly the same view reappeared, this time with a normal north-south orientation. I could see a line of lights that seemed to outline the shores of an ocean, and there were clusters of lights from other cities as well. Then lines appeared on the screen marking national borders, and circles and names popped up around the major cities. I realized that I was looking down from a satellite at a nighttime view of the whole Middle East. Suddenly the screen zoomed in, then zoomed in further. Now all I could see was what appeared to be the lights of a small town in the desert with a highway running by it. The caption read, "Dimona." Too close, a voice spoke up, and then it looked as though we were climbing through the atmosphere. Now I could see the coast of the Mediterranean in the northwest corner of the screen and a dark area toward the east. "That's the Dead Sea," Esther whispered to me, pointing at the picture. "A little further, please." The voice said, and suddenly we could see the whole of Israel and parts of its neighbors. "All right, people, we're approaching 0 hour," the disembodied voice said, and suddenly Esther was gripping my hand very tightly. The screen might look like some sort of media presentation, but her anxiety reminded me that there were real people down there. "Keep your eyes on the north and northeast," she whispered again. "That's where we think the attack will come from." "Syria and Iraq?" I asked. She only nodded. The time display ticked off the seconds, and I noticed there wasn't a sound in the room. Finally, when the clock displayed 12 a.m., I heard a collective intake of breath, but nothing happened that we could see. The seconds ticked by and I could hear whispered comments. "I told you so," I heard someone say, and then Esther's nails bit into my hand. "There," she said, pointing at a tiny orange-red arrow rising from the desert north of Israel. Then another and another blossomed. At first each one appeared almost to stand still, but then they began to arc over and fly south. More arrows lifted off from the northeast. "Holy cow," someone exclaimed. "Those guys really did it. There must be over 24 of them, probably Scud-Ds," another voice speculated. Now the flaming arrows were past Jerusalem and coursing over the Dead Sea. Someone had put a marker with a timer on Dimona, and it was evident even to my untrained eye that it was the target. This was like watching a disaster in slow motion. I didn't want to watch yet. I was mesmerized, unable to turn away. Suddenly, new flashes appeared all around Dimona, and then there were new arrows of light rising into the air. Time seemed to crawl, and the oncoming arrows never wavered until I was sure that our antivirus had failed and the Patriots had missed. Then a large yellow blossom appeared in the night sky almost directly over Dimona, and almost immediately the darkness was filled with fiery flowers that glowed and then seemed to flutter away. Then Esther flung her arms around me and was hugging me tightly. "You did it. You did it," she cried. As I hugged her back, I could hear cheering from the people in the room. Then a voice said, "Situation report from Dimona, 1 missile got through." Esther jerked around and we both stared at the screen. Missile was apparently knocked off course and hit south of town. Only minor damage is being reported. There were more cheers. Suddenly I gasped for air and I realized I'd been holding my breath throughout the entire attack. But before I could say anything, the display showed a new series of launches. Only these originated from within the state of Israel. "What's happening?" I asked in confusion, but when I looked over, Esther was staring intently. "Patriots are not the only missiles we have," she said, never looking away from the screen. "Those are Delilah's, ground-launched cruise missiles carrying cluster munitions. Our radar will have tracked the path of every Scud and calculated the reciprocal course. Now we return fire." She turned to me and her face had a determined look. "You didn't think we would allow them to attack without retribution, did you?" Even as I watched, the telltale lights were heading north and east. But this time I realized there were no Patriots to defend against the oncoming threat. I did look away then. I sat quietly in my chair and watched the congratulatory hugs and handshakes around the room. Soon afterwards, Esther was called away to take a phone call, and then I really felt like the odd man out. After a while, an MP came looking for me. "Sir, the NSA director is going to be here for a while. He's instructed me to offer you the services of the helicopter to take you and MS Freeman wherever you need to go." Esther returned just then, and the two of us followed our escort through the corridors and out to the helipad. I thought she'd be dancing with joy, but she seemed somewhat down. When we climbed up into the helicopter, she leaned over to the pilot and asked, "Would it be possible for you to take me to Dulles International Airport?" "What's going on?" I asked in surprise. "You know we say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth," she said with a serious look. "The missile counterstrike you saw back there was the eye for an eye. Now I've been called back to be part of a tooth for a tooth. I'm catching the first plane to Tel Aviv tonight." "Oh," I said glumly. "I thought maybe." She smiled and squeezed my hand. I would have liked to celebrate as well, but we don't always get to decide such things. The helicopter covered the 25 miles to Dulles in very little time at all, and then Esther was leaving. She turned to me and took my hands in hers. "You have surprised me in many ways, Thomas Selfridge. I will never forget you." Then she hugged me quickly and was gone before I could think of anything to say. I was in a strange mood on my way back to College Park. Now that everything was over, the events of the last week seemed unreal, like scenes from a movie that flickered through my memory. The places I'd been, the people I'd met, the things that I'd done, none of it felt quite real. Part of the problem, I knew, was the way my emotions had gone back and forth through the spectrum. It was like I'd been dreaming under anesthesia and was having a hard time shaking off the effects. But when I got home, I had to enter through the side door because there was a sheet of plywood nailed over my shattered front door. And the living room was just as disheveled as when I'd been there last. "I guess it wasn't a dream," I told myself wryly. I managed to find something to eat in the refrigerator and then returned to the living room, where I righted an overturned chair and flopped down. Maybe it was just the adrenaline wearing off, but I began to feel down. I glanced at the clock and realized that it was almost midnight. Darn, the Christmas break was over and I had to be at work tomorrow. I wandered back to the bedroom and turned on the light. Everywhere around me were signs of Ginny photographs, her clothes, furniture that she'd picked out. I looked at the bed and couldn't help but wonder if she and Amir had ever. It was too much. I grabbed a blanket and went back to the living room to try to sleep on the couch. January 2nd, the couch wasn't very comfortable to sleep on and I woke up early. But I really didn't mind because I was eager to see what the Washington Post had to say about the ISIS attack. I didn't expect my name would make the coverage, but I couldn't help but wonder if there would be any mention of the team that had developed the antivirus, but there was nothing on the front page. And when I took the paper inside and went through it carefully, I found nothing anywhere. How do you keep something like that secret, I wondered. I went on into work at the usual time and everything seemed normal. My coworkers showed no sign of awareness of anything unusual. "How was your holiday?" they asked, and I realized they had no way of knowing what had transpired. It was a little disappointing. Then about an hour later, I got a summons to see Ben's boss. I was smiling when I entered, expecting congratulations and maybe more, but instead I got a scowl. He held up a document with my signature on it. When you joined the NSA, you signed an oath to protect any information you gathered while you work here. Under Section 18 of the U.S. Legal Code, disclosure of any information about codes or ciphers of the U.S. or any foreign government, or any information relating to the acquisition or use of any device, apparatus, or appliance involving such code is subject to a fine and/or imprisonment for up to 10 years. That particularly applies to the session you witnessed yesterday and all events leading up it. Are we clear on that? Selfridge, when I nodded dumbly, he said, "Good. Then you need to get back to work." What a letdown, I thought as I headed back to my floor. I didn't want to meddle, but a little gratitude would have been nice by now. It was clear that somebody had clamped a lid on the whole affair. Not only wouldn't there be any ticker tape parades in my future, but I was beginning to feel as though I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The depression I'd been feeling last night returned, and it was compounded by the fact that I had another unpleasant duty to perform. I went on the internet and began searching for a divorce attorney. Things only got worse over the next few weeks. I saw a reference to the FBI, and that reminded me about Agent Henry. I did a Google search on him and found a small news item buried in the Knoxville News-Sentinel. It reported that a federal employee named John Henry had died in a traffic accident in Frozen Head State Park. He was 37 years old. There were no other details. That made me sad. Henry was a decent guy who had died trying to protect me. I thought he deserved a lot better than a truncated obituary. I tried to get a little more information from FBI headquarters, but I hit a blank wall. A few days later, a guy who sits next to me popped his head around the corner. "Hey, did you hear the news? Our boss's boss is getting a nice promotion. Apparently he pulled off some sort of coup over the holidays, and now he's getting his reward." I didn't say anything, but inwardly I was seething. As far as I knew, the only thing he'd done to stop ISIS was to use me as bait. And now he was being rewarded. I thought about trying to go to the director of the NSA about what was going on. But before I could explore that avenue, some kind of commotion about Israel came up on Capitol Hill. The IDF had made some sort of incursion into Syria, and many in Congress were up in arms about Israeli aggression. When it came out that the NSA had made certain intercepted communications available to the IDF, there were howls of protest, and the next thing I knew, the director had resigned and the NSA had a new leader. There was even talk about delaying Israel's purchase of additional Patriot missile batteries, but ultimately the deal went through. And just to add insult to injury, my efforts to divorce Ginny were going nowhere. I'd planned to file using irreconcilable differences, but my attorney informed me that Maryland wasn't a no-fault state. Adultery, desertion, conviction of certain crimes, insanity, cruelty, and vicious conduct, those are the grounds for divorce in Maryland, he said. How frustrating. I had legal grounds to divorce Ginny, but I couldn't prove she had been unfaithful without bringing up classified information, and that would get me into a lot of trouble. Isn't there any way to get divorced without having to go through all that? I asked. Actually, you can get a no-fault divorce in Maryland. But to do that, you two have to have been living separately for at least a year, he told me calmly. In the meantime, you can file for a limited divorce, which puts you in line for an absolute divorce after a year of separation. So that's what I did, but it bothered me to have to wait so long to be free of her. I also wasn't happy about having to pay Ginny temporary spousal support. After what she had done, it didn't seem fair, but I didn't have a choice. As winter turned into spring, my mood did not improve. If anything, it worsened. I found myself increasingly alone, both at work and at home. My job no longer brought me any satisfaction. The one big accomplishment I'd achieved had become a secret that nobody could talk about. It quickly became clear that management was unhappy with me, and my coworkers started avoiding me. Outside of work, it was a similar situation, but for different reasons. All the friends we had were couples who were used to hanging out together. I was the odd one out. And since no one really knew why Ginny and I had broken up, I think a lot of them blamed me. The end result was that I spent a lot of time thinking about my life. It seemed like every time I had tried to do the right thing, I had been punished. I had tried to support and take care of Ginny. I didn't expect her to be grateful, but I would have liked some loyalty. Similarly, I didn't want to be involved in a dangerous situation with terrorists, but when it happened, I did my best. I didn't want any medals or special recognition, but some acknowledgement would have been nice. Increasingly, I began to feel used. Ginny had certainly used me. All she wanted was my support while she got her laser treatments. Well, maybe that's an exaggeration. I guess she did love me at one point. But that love disappeared quickly when her birthmark was gone and other men started noticing her. The same thing was true about my work. After humiliating me with the news of Ginny's affair, my boss used me as bait for terrorists. And now he was the one getting rewarded. Come to think of it, hadn't Esther used me too? All she really wanted was for me to solve the Al-Andalus puzzle. Once she got what she needed, she left without even saying goodbye. I never heard from her again. I knew that wasn't entirely fair. After all, Esther had saved my life and risked her own life to do so. But she wouldn't have done that if she didn't think I could help her. Overall, I was tired of being used, tired of being stuck in a marriage with an unfaithful wife, and tired of holding a job where I wasn't appreciated. I felt an increasing urge to get away, to start fresh in a place where nobody had any claims on me. And when I got there, I promised myself I would finally prioritize my own needs. I had spent too much of my life trying to please others. Now it was time to do something for myself. The old me would have been shocked. Don't make any hasty decisions, I would have warned. You have responsibilities to others, I would have reasoned. Well, forget that. The few times in my life I had made impulsive decisions, things turned out fine, even if nobody else knew. So I made another impulsive decision that felt right for me. If anyone else didn't like it, tough luck. December 31st, the following year, cheers erupted from the other people at the bar as we watched the fireworks explode over the Auckland Harbor Bridge. I smiled to myself. The scene looked exactly like the display in the war room at the NSA a year ago. I had so much to celebrate. I had left everything behind except my computer, a few personal items, and a bag of clothes. I bought a one-way ticket to Auckland, New Zealand. I chose Auckland for 3 reasons. It was as far as I could go while still being able to speak English. I didn't know anyone there, and, I'll admit it, I had been captivated by the beautiful landscapes in the Lord of the Rings movies. Once again, it turned out I had made the right decision. I discovered that the people in New Zealand were incredibly friendly and welcoming, so I didn't feel as lonely as I thought I would. I also found a job very quickly. I had enough money to support myself until I found work, but luck was on my side and I landed a great opportunity almost immediately. The Ann's banking group had recently faced a cybersecurity threat, and my expertise with computer viruses and malware made me a highly sought-after candidate. After starting my new job, I rented a cozy 2-bedroom apartment and began immersing myself in the Kiwi culture. Making the big decision to leave Maryland was a lot of work. It's not easy to unravel yourself from your old life, but I managed it. After resigning from my job, transferring my thrift savings plan, paying my bills, and taking care of short-term tasks, I gave my lawyer the power to handle the most significant problem of all, Ginny. I told him she could have the house in place of alimony and left him to deal with everything else as he saw fit. The only issue was that Ginny refused to accept the reality. She resisted cooperating with the divorce process and did everything she could to delay it. I had instructed my lawyer not to disclose my whereabouts or contact information to her under any circumstances. However, that only led her to pester him, and he began to charge me for all the time spent dealing with her. Eventually, it became clear that I would have to talk to her, whether I liked it or not. Finally, I arranged a Skype session with her. Unbeknownst to her, I had to wake up before dawn to have the call. That did little to improve my mood. New Zealand is the last stop on the internet, the final destination of the fiber optic undersea cables that connect the world. As a result, connections are often poor and interruptions are common. However, somehow we got lucky, and when we finally had our face-to-face, our connection was stable. When the call connected and her face appeared on my computer screen, it jolted me. She still looked beautiful, and her image reminded me of the woman I had fallen in love with so long ago. This won't be easy, I thought. The call didn't begin well. She demanded to know where I was, and when I refused to tell her, she alternated between anger and tears. "Why did you run away?" she sniffled. "Why won't you tell me where you are?" I sighed. "Honestly, Ginny, you broke my heart, and I couldn't bear to be around all the places and things that reminded me of you. Finally, I decided that the only solution was to distance myself as much as possible. To my surprise, she smiled. "That means you still have feelings for me," she said cheerfully. "Why don't you put an end to this nonsense and come back to me?" I tried not to be sarcastic. "Ginny, you cheated on me. You broke our marriage vows and had an affair with another man. How can I come back to you after that?" Her face fell, but then she became determined. "I know, Thomas, and I feel awful about it, but I was vulnerable." "Why?" I demanded. "Why were you vulnerable?" She shook her head, as though I couldn't possibly understand. "Well, of course, because I had just finished my last laser treatment and I was still adjusting to my new appearance. When he came along and told me I was beautiful, of course, I was tempted to respond. That really annoyed me. But I told you that you were beautiful," I said. "I've always believed that since the first time I met you, yes, but you said that before I had my birthmark removed." He had never seen me like that, so his compliments meant more to me, she said brightly. I couldn't find the words to respond to that, but my expression must have conveyed my reaction because Ginny suddenly changed her tone and her face clouded. "But I don't want to dwell on that. I've been so lonely without you," she sniffled. "I've cried every day. I know what I did was terrible, and I've regretted it countless times." She paused to wipe her tears and then continued. "But it wasn't entirely my fault. I had no way of knowing that Amir was some sort of spy trained in seduction. To me, he was just an attractive guy who showered me with compliments and sweet words. I got carried away before I even realized it. And the worst part? He wasn't even interested in me. He was only using me to gain information about you." She blew her nose and added, "I guess that's why he always wanted to go to our house." I had calmed down, but when I heard that, my anger flared up again. Before I could say anything, she hurriedly spoke. "But let's not focus on that. I've learned a lot about myself through this, Thomas, and I know I would be a much better wife if you would just come back. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive me? It would make me so happy. Everything could go back to the way it was. What do you say, honey?" I had been observing her as she spoke. Her appearance was just as I remembered, and her voice was the same, but something felt different now. Then it hit me, I no longer loved her. "Ginny, I've listened carefully to everything you've said," I told her. "Throughout this entire conversation, there are two things I haven't heard. You made it clear what you want and how you feel, but you haven't mentioned me or my feelings once," I said. "Well, of course I care about how you feel," she interrupted. "I know you were hurt and upset, and you had every right to be. But if we get back together, I'll spend all my time making it up to you." And I raised my hand, and she finally realized I wasn't finished. When she stopped, I continued. "There's something else I didn't hear. You spoke a lot, but not once did you say, 'I love you,'" she gasped and then blurted out, "But of course I love you. That goes without saying. I've always loved you," and now it was my turn to interrupt. "No, Ginny, love is not something that goes without saying. It's not just words, it's something you demonstrate through your actions. It's not just what you do, but also what you don't do. And cheating with someone else because he flatters you with sweet words is not a way to show love. I'm sorry about Ginny, but this conversation has only reinforced my belief that we won't be getting back together. Goodbye, Ginny." I ended the call, leaving her tear-stained face frozen on the screen. It still hurt to lose someone who once meant so much to me, but after hearing her, I knew I had made the right decision. December 31st, 2 years later, I had been to a party with friends earlier in the evening, but it felt right to spend the New Year's Eve countdown at the bar I discovered during my first year in New Zealand. It overlooked Auckland Harbor, and the other patrons had welcomed me then. I once again felt a sense of belonging as I raised my glass and gazed out at the fireworks display. The past 2 years had been wonderful for me. Ginny finally agreed to the divorce, and instead of spousal support, I gave her the house. It was official. I was now a free man. My career was also thriving. After working at the bank for a year, I gained a reputation as a cybersecurity expert and started my own consultation business. Things took a turn for the better when the National Cybersecurity Center approached me for help. This gave my business a stamp of approval, and my permanent residency application got approved. I was now officially a citizen of New Zealand. With the success of my business, I was able to purchase a beautiful home with a view of Auckland Harbor. Overall, I was glad I made the decision to move. In the dimly lit bar, I struggled to recognize the woman standing behind me. But when she greeted me with a Happy New Year, Thomas Selfridge, I immediately recognized her accent. I turned around and hugged her without hesitation. Happy New Year to you too, Esther. After a moment, we let go of each other, and I finally got a good look at her. She was wearing a sleeveless black cotton sweater and skin-tight jeans, which highlighted her toned physique. I even noticed the faint scar on her right shoulder. However, this time she had her dark hair tucked under a baseball cap with a long brim that partially covered her face. When she looked up to admire a firework display over the harbor, I noticed the black patch covering her right eye. The bar crowd was getting louder, so I leaned close to her ear and suggested, "Would you like to go somewhere quieter so we can catch up?" She smiled and replied, "I would love that." We got into my car and drove away from the bustling downtown to Herne Bay. As I pulled into my driveway, Esther let out a whistle of admiration. "You must be doing incredibly well, Thomas. I'm genuinely happy for you." I poured us both drinks and led her out onto the deck. From there, we had a different view of the harbor, but we could still enjoy the fireworks in the distance. Despite the sea breeze, it was warm outside. It felt strange to welcome the new year during summertime after 3 years abroad. After a few minutes, Esther turned to me and removed her cap. "Well, aren't you curious about my eye?" Without the cap, I noticed a diagonal scar that started below the eye patch and extended through her eyebrow, leaving a visible white line on her olive-colored skin. "Please tell me what happened," I gently asked. She placed her cap back on and took a seat on one of the deck chairs. "Honestly, it was my own fault. When I returned to Israel, I managed to track down one of the ISIS leaders responsible for the Al-Andalus attack. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the hidden knife he had in time." She then smirked. "But I can assure you that he won't be plotting any more schemes." Remembering how she bravely endured my clumsy attempt to stitch up her arm, I had no trouble believing that she could withstand such a devastating injury and still strike a fatal blow on her enemy. Couldn't the doctors? I gestured towards her eye patch. She shook her head. The wound was too severe, and by the time I could return to my team and get airlifted to a hospital, it was too late. She shrugged. Perhaps it was best to change the subject, so I inquired, "Are you still working with Mossad?" The expression on her face immediately told me I had chosen the wrong question. "They expelled me," she responded with clipped bitterness. With my appearance, it became impossible for me to go undercover again. Moreover, being right-handed, my marksmanship suffered greatly. They offered me a desk job in another government department, but I wanted no part in that. She fell silent, her unhappiness evident. After a few moments, she looked up at me again. "These past 3 years have been challenging in many ways." I had. Well, I suppose you could call him a partner back in Tel Aviv, and we had discussed a more permanent future once I left the service. However, when I returned home to recover from my injuries, he couldn't handle it. He never said anything, but he could never bring himself to look at my face. I guess he wasn't the person I thought he was, even though she tried to downplay the impact. Her expression betrayed her pain. I pulled up a chair beside her and wrapped my arm around her shoulder. We sat silently for a while, gazing out at the city and the harbor below. Finally, I asked the question that had been on my mind the entire time. "So, how did you manage to find me here in New Zealand?" "I pulled some strings with old contacts and tracked you down," she replied with a small smile. "You did an excellent job of starting fresh." Returning the smile, I said, "At the time, I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and my old life. But I've built a new life here, and it feels like home." I studied her intently. "You haven't told me why you sought me out." Her expression turned pensive. "You were such a surprise, Thomas. When we first met, I assumed you were just a computer code savvy nerd. But I discovered depths in you that I never expected. I witnessed your bravery in the face of danger and how you handled challenging situations that would make most people falter. When I had to leave, I regretted not having the opportunity to learn more about you." She paused and gazed out into the darkness. "The other reason is that the time we spent together, despite its craziness and danger, was better than any other time since then." She turned to face me. "I missed it, and I missed being with you." Suddenly, her face took on an expression I couldn't immediately decipher. "Besides," she said in a husky voice, "we still have unfinished business. We never got the chance to celebrate." Without warning, she pulled my head towards hers and hugged me passionately, making it difficult for either of us to catch our breath. I stood up and embraced her tightly, and we clung to each other as if we were drowning. After a moment, I led her inside into my bedroom, both of us consumed by desire. It took us 3 attempts to quell that burning passion. The next morning, I woke up to the soft reddish light of dawn streaming through the windows of my bedroom. Esther's body was curled up next to mine, and a smile formed on my face as I recollected our celebration. Carefully, I sat up, trying not to disturb her. As I did, I noticed her eye patch had slipped off her head during the night, and I picked it up curiously. That's when she woke up and saw what I was holding, causing her to exclaim, "Give it back." She immediately sat up and snatched the black band from my hand. "Don't look at me," she desperately pleaded as she turned away, trying to secure the band around her head and cover her ruined, empty eye socket with the patch. Once she had it in place, she bent over, sobbing while holding her hands over her face. I wrapped my arm around her and allowed her to cry. As I felt her tremors, I experienced emotions that had long been dormant within me. This woman once saved my life, I thought, and now I have the chance to save hers. Equally surprising was my unwavering certainty that this was what I truly wanted, not only for her but for myself as well. I gently turned her towards me and gently removed her hands from her face. Then, I reached up and gingerly took off her eye patch once again. "No," she whimpered. "I'm so hideous, you're mistaken," I said softly. "You look at your face and can only see your eye. I look at you and see a beautiful, brave woman. You see the scar, I see the entirety of who you are." She stared at me with doubt, which gradually transformed into wonder and hope. In an instant, she flung her arms around me and hugged me. I knew right then that I had made another incredibly wise decision.